At the start of the speech, I have two quick observations. The first is to note Dan spends a lot of time in this debate about the set of people that don't like their current conditions, but might like the conditions of another country. A huge amount of counter fiat that they provided for us in this debate by modelling it aggressively as possible means we'll provide as much as possible the ability for people to move from one country they don't like to one country they do like. Which means rapidly narrows this debate to the set of people that have such sets of priority there is no nation state in the world which do genuinely compete to want people in it to provide them with those needs. We quite simply identify we think those views are probably abhorrent and we will not stand for them in this debate. The second is I'm going to take a quick silver bullet attempt to win this debate. I think it's deeply questionable if this debate actually requires these islands to be uninhabitable in the status quo. That is, they're habitable but they have no people on them right now. It simply says, should designate habitable islands as anarchists. I think this team needs to fan turning the UK and Australia into anarchist island. They make no attempt I want to note, this is obviously a bit of a joke, but it is an instant win for us. So I've spent 30 seconds on it, they probably need to spend 4 minutes explaining why this First, let's explain why consent is violated by the set of people that do have the ability to choose to move to this island or leave it, and second, why the set of people who have no ability to decide if they end up on that island or not have their consent violated. Then I'll explain why this island is not peaceful at all, and I will explain then why the conditions and the people who are willing to live on this island, and not the set of people that Dan emphasized who would like to live here. I think these sets of people probably only visit a short amount of times, or only the most fucked up people live on this island. That would be our winning condition. First, let's talk about consent and why the set of people who might decide they want to live on this island kind of proactively, because they currently live in a state, do so under false pretenses. Because Dan is correct. Most people do not want to live in chaos. And unfortunately, there's a subset of people that like to. They're called libertarians. Udai Kamath is one of them. And these people are drunk on their own fucking Kool-Aid, and they believe that they are the toughest and strongest, which means when chaos breaks out, they will get what they want. They will win the battle, they will have the biggest guns. And they're just ideologically drawn in such a way to believe that this is an acceptable form of society, that most of us, who believe that there is a risk when they walk down the road that someone will attack us or rob us, they believe that is a risk worth taking on when the rest of us do not. These people are fundamentally foolish in this way. We don't think this is a genuine preference in the sense that they should be allowed to do so. We think this is a preference they've drawn out of immaturity and of foolishness, out of lack of information. Because they don't understand what this island looks like, because I don't know why anyone on this island would be actively promoting it or telling them what it looks like. They're also likely to be adverse to viewing the status quo as particularly bad. I'm sure Udai will get up, as Dan has, to explain how bad the status quo is and how bad the grip of the state is. This is the sort of propaganda these people believe, because they've experienced living under a state, because that is the alternative that exists in the world, and they do not understand how bad anarchy is likely to be. So I think these people make a foolish and rash decision. And this team attempts to alleviate that decision by saying, well, these people will be freely able to leave this island. Obviously, this team can model in there's a ferry that takes them to the closest state. I don't think this team ever attempts to explain how you get to that ferry. Because I simply think this island is of so much chaos, it's unclear that there is not a man standing in front of that ferry with a gun who asks you to stay, who asks to abuse you instead. If you do not do so, you die. And I think that is a big problem this Affirmative team will need to overcome. And that means I don't think these people are able to return. I do not think their consent is one that they can freely give and freely withdraw, and we think that's probably the standard that occurs in this debate. But this set of actors is the least important of the two we're talking about here, because it's obviously the set of people that don't have the ability to decide to enter this island or flee this island that are people most problematically harmed in this debate. Because probably quite naturally, on human, just like how we work, probably there's a set of people that are fucking on this island and hence producing children. I don't know why these sets of people have the ability to leave as an infant. I don't know why they understand this world. I definitely think they're likely to be harmed by the chaos that occurs on this island. Similarly, I don't think a set of people that are trafficked on nefarious means will have the ability to say, sorry buddy, I don't really want to be your slave or your sex slave or whatever other fucked up things I can't even imagine, and say I'll just pop down to the ferry and leave. So this team can model, they can't resolve the problem in this way. And I think that means, well, to the extent that this team is correct, we do not consent to living in a state. The state gives us a set of rights that we are able to protect ourselves. Because obviously we do things like take tax from people unfairly, we force people to go to school. We do so under the belief that those rights are worth it, and those things are fundamental to human dignity. I disagree, as the rest of us obviously don't, because we are sane. And it is in that trade-off that we accept that we are happy to coerce people into living into a state. And we resolve the question of first affirmative by identifying that maybe you don't need to live in the state you were born. We'll happily try and help as many people as possible flee the states they do not like. Let's first then explain why this island is likely to be not particularly peaceful. I think this team actually makes no attempt. Like, I thought Udai was going to get up and give you a whole bunch of explanations on how, like, everyone having nukes would mean that there was, like, mutually assured destruction and everyone would behave or something like that. But I haven't even bothered to attempt to do this so far. And that means that every time there's some sort of agreement saying, well, we're a lovely commune with norms, which is as close as they come to a mechanism first affirmative, or maybe, like, you know, like, I won't shoot you if you don't shoot me, or if anyone breaks a set of common contracts, then that person will be punished in some way. There's probably the sets of explanations this team will get around to if they decide to. Probably those things are unlikely to resolve, and they're unlikely to hold. And that's because, of course, it's fair enough that in one single game of this, like, game theory, you probably aren't incentivized to break that deal, but over the long term, you only need this deal to be broken once. You only need that one person to decide, well, I'll steal something from my neighbor, I will, you know, like, to steal someone and rape them or do some other terrible thing to them, to believe you will break that norm at least at some point. And of course, the problem then is, how do you reinforce this situation in the society or the commune you're attempting to implement in the first place back? You need some force, you need some state, you need some ability or legitimacy to use violence to resolve that. It's unclear how that occurs in this one. And I think that means the violence returns to these islands. These islands are unstable, even if they do have strong ideological ideas like we'll be a communist commune or something like that. So peace breaks down. These islands are incredibly expensive to be on because you need to win the arms race to be safe. You can't even outsource your own protection because you can't trust that contracts will be upheld. There's no legal punishment for doing so. If the contract you're trying to get is for someone to defend you, and you say, no, you stole my worker, but that person has a bigger gun. You can't enforce that contract. You can't be safe. This team has two ways of attempting to identify why these islands will indeed be safe. The first is they attempted to claim the competition will mean these states get better. I think there's two problems with this claim. First, I think it's probably clear that there's probably enough people that say there's like 20 islands in this team's squad. There's probably 20 lunatics who would like to be the king of Cum. So I think there is enough people to try and go and violate the communist commune, even if it has good intentions. You only need a couple of people that have huge egos to enjoy doing that. They probably do set up their own new laws, which are probably even worse than any state they're talking about in this debate. But the bigger problem here is, I don't know why these islands are competing against each other. Usually when we use these mechanisms in debates, we're like, well, the company wants more consumers, they'll earn more profit. I don't know why the communist commune wants more people in its island. Like, it gets worse every time the small amount of resources that exist on that island get shared among smaller and smaller people. These islands become less enjoyable, so actually these states have an incentive to stop people accessing the island, not improve themselves and compete against each other. Finally, let's explain why these islands are truly so fun. And it's hidden in the previous argument. But obviously, this set of people that are willing to live in a state that is so chaotic, so unpeaceful, and so scary and of such large risk, are the set of people that are so deeply evil in the status quo, they don't believe they can safely do the evil things they want to do. Because I would note that there's a lot of evil you can get away with in this world, unfortunately. You can hide in a log cabin with your gun, you can bribe the police to do an awful lot of awful things. Like, I think most people get away with running drug trafficking in circles for quite a long time. Which means it's only the worst in the world that is required to flee states at all, but access an island. I'm talking about people who develop biological weapons, who are pirates and terrorists and pedophiles, who traffic humans, and who want to run Squid Games. I think these claims are things that violate human dignity in such an extent and to such a large amount that we should not, as humans, allow another one to do that to another person for a crouching game.
Firstly, I'll prove that anarchism is a good and legitimate political philosophy. Secondly, I'll talk about their best case, which is Evil Island. And thirdly, I'll talk about our best case, which is Good Happy Island. Firstly, anarchism is a legitimate political philosophy. And I want to note here that this will cut through a huge amount of the bluster of First Negative, who says the only people who go here are evil freaks who want to do evil stuff. If we can explain that this is a legitimate position that many people currently and historically have inhabited, that it's a rich part of political philosophy that people believe in, that people have thought deeply about, and that is a reasonable thing to stand behind, then you should side almost intuitively with side affirmative. And that cuts through all their claims about consent, it cuts through their claims about evil freaks inhabiting these islands. Their understanding of anarchism is just philosophically impoverished. And the first or second observation I'll make here is that we don't have to prove anarchism is like the right philosophy. We just have to show that given the hugely diverse conception of goodness and freedom and justice that tracks the diversity of humans' values and personalities across time, time, this is a legitimate thing that people can opt into. That is a moral intuition that we attempt, though we would contest that in the status quo we fail, to uphold with democracy. The burden on the affirmative team is very low. I would point to the many anarchists through history whose response to the horrific exercises of state power has been disgust and anger. That is a legitimate and a virtuous response to a power that holds, huge amounts of power over your life. Those are people who have not had their appetite for freedom dulled by law and dulled by the status quo, as many people in this room have. I think that is virtuous, and I think we should give people the life they choose and the life that would allow them to flourish. What do they say to this? Libertarians are freaks. I think, well, one, I've already contested that with my characterization, which is to say, secondly though, maybe you're very comfortable with your happy life in the status quo in the rich world. Your conception of anarchy is breaking away from just laws. Many people's conception of anarchy is breaking away from unjust laws, and we should allow those people islands to go to. But secondly, all our competition mechanisms, which I'll rebuild in more detail in a moment, explain why the best islands will be the most populous ones. But I note finally that if you believe that these people are particularly powerful people, that indicates that they can consent better than the people who would opt in on their side. That characterization is tense. We say that those individuals consent. They consent to an important social structure which is important to them. We should give people lives they want. And I note that granting people a choice is an independent benefit in and of itself. That's a reason why participating in democracy or voting is valuable to people, even if that vote doesn't have concrete outcomes, because that sense of choice and agency is something that provides people an incredible amount of meaning. We've already won because we are the side that allows people democracy. We are the side that allows people to meaningfully exercise their preferences. And that is not a weak argument. That is the baseline that you should support in how people construct societies, the way they opt into lives that they think would allow them to flourish. Secondly, then, I'll deal with their best case, which is about Evil Island. I just want to note at the start here that the negative team is extraordinarily status quo biased. I would note it's pretty hard to tell what morally good or morally bad laws are. Yes, there are some things that objectively are morally bad, but my claim is that many of the things we think are bad or good, we should be pretty humble about our capacity to know that, right? Because our sense of morality and what laws are just or not changes and has changed radically through history, because, as we explain at Daniel, you often impose obligations through laws that must be balanced through rights, and that balance is not perfectly calibrated by any one individual, and that our assessment of justice just is often incredibly status quo biased. It's hard to see through the water you're swimming in. But let's assume that these three negative speakers have a direct line to God. Their fears will not eventuate for a number of reasons. One, most people aren't evil. Intuition check this. Very few people are pedophiles. Most people are relatively nice, and lots of people who are anarchists because they have legitimate objections to state power. Those are reasonable fears that people have about the power of the state that should allow them to join these islands. Secondly, even in the absence of laws, there are social norms that restrict behaviour. And I know that you might have different countries with different legal codes, but people often have pretty similar conceptions of, say, fairness. They just disagree about how that fairness should eventuate through law. Things like equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. Most people have similar values in that sense, but they think laws should be different. But thirdly, as we know, islands often compete with one another. And importantly, you need to last. You can't just get a bunch of crazy people on an island together. You have to produce food and water. You have to have some capacity to make your society functional. And the things that select for functionality, like not being crazy or not killing your neighbours, are also things that mean you get a more populous and flourishing island over time. But fourthly, I know you can better respond to evil, which, as first negative says, occurs in the status quo already. People do terrible things on, Australia Island, right? And obviously you should be able to respond to that. As we explained, in the status quo, many laws are unjust. Laws criminalise homosexuality, laws allow slavery, and there is no legal way to fight them. On our side, you have mob rule, and you can kill pedophiles if you want. Maybe that's a good thing in some cases. But I would note finally that the most evil islands are the ones that attract the most opposition. So that's why the mechanism works well for us. And Tom says, well, you only need one person to break the rule once and have no recourse. What are you going to do? There's no government. You have mob rule, right? Maybe you kill the most evil people, and that potentially is fine if that's something people have opted into. They say, well, 20 lunatics can just get together. Why would they do that? The island won't be functional. But importantly, if 20 murderers get together on Murder Island, that's fine, because no non-murderer is going to go to Murder Island. Clearly you select for people who are similar to you. Maybe evil people join together, but they have to prove that a substantial number of people, or even a small amount, which I don't think they managed to prove, slip through the cracks through all the incentive they have to not go to Murder Island, or to think about that choice pretty deeply, and to go there instead. Absolutely ridiculous. What do they say on consent in an attempt to get around this? They say you might not be able to consent, maybe there are traffickers, or it's hard to leave. But again, I think we do have pretty substantial fear to mean that people are able to go back and forth as they wish. But secondly, secondly, it relies again on the idea that these communities are particularly bad. We explain that many people opt into anarchism for pretty reasonable reasons. They want to have communes where they, exist in an ANCAP society with one another. You cannot thrive if you're just full of crime. Why do you want to keep people on your island who don't want to be there? But there are also other reasons consent would be particularly high, that information exists, people have every incentive to seek it out, and importantly, the more dangerous the island is, the more incentive you have to seek out that information, and it's no comparative to the lack of consent in the status quo. If this team talks about externalities these islands might create, then that falls down as well, because I would note externalities from, states occur in the status quo. States pollute one another's waters, they go to war, which bleed into their neighbours' waters. That happens already, it's unclear that occurs from them. So, that's out of the debate. Then secondly, on the good use of this island, we present three extremely important benefits. Number one, people are just able to escape extremely unjust states, and they say, well, we'll just use our counter fiat to let people move between countries. One, they do not have the counter fiat to do that, because we are taking unused islands and letting people go to them, which, yeah, it's kind of hard to do, but pretty doable. They are literally transforming the immigration policy of every country in the world, which would be extraordinarily politically unpopular, like basically the most politically unpopular thing you could ever do would start wars that would kill people. And secondly, we explain though that other states are just bad in addition, so maybe you don't want to move between state whose laws you don't consent to A to state whose laws you don't consent to B. You want to go to Anarchy Island because you are an anarchist. And importantly, in response to their silver bullet, we don't have to designate all islands Anarchy Islands, we just have to designate some of them, so we won't designate Australia. The other benefits we give you, which are unresponded to, are now, one, states' behaviour are better because they have to compete with islands, and currently they compete with no one. It's often pretty hard to leave a country, it's hard to enter another one. Now states have to make their laws better so people don't flee. And secondly, you just get way more policy innovation. You understand what life is like with certain degrees of libertarianism or certain degrees of anarchy. That is very, very valuable for people's understanding of policy, people's understanding of their own lives, and people's understanding of what it means to flourish. This negative team is extraordinarily status quo biased, they're extraordinarily unimaginative, and the affirmative team takes the debate.
Regrettably for this affirmative team, this question is actually far less theoretical than they think. In the 18th century, a crew of the English Royal Navy mutinied their captain, took the ship to Tahiti, kidnapped a series of local and native women, took them to Pitcairn Island, which is somewhere to the northeast of Australia in the Pacific Islands, and established an anarchy island or a cum island there. And what resulted was a place that still exists today, but a place that has been wrought for its entire existence with scandal after scandal of child sex abuse and of gross abuses of power. A might makes right. An entire group of men, something like 54 or 55 of them, were tried in 2004. And the way that these men continued operating a sex ring of their own children for decades on this island was they were the only people who knew how to operate the longboats that took people from that island to nearby Norfolk Island to resupply, to take people away from that island. And yeah, that is still a place that had food, that had water, that continued to be able to exist, but it was a place where might makes right, and where the physically powerful and the socially powerful were able to import that power to the detriment of everybody else who lived on that island and was unable to leave. This team attempts to make themselves look sensible and us look silly by playing games of fiat and playing games of principle. This is the reality of what happens when you allow people to dominate geographically isolated places and impose their wills on others, because for every single instance this team can name of a rogue state or a shitty state that has subjugated people and abrogated their rights, there is yet another example, perhaps dozens of examples of where the power of a state and that mutual agreement, yes, to some extent the abrogation of some people's consent, has made life better for the very weakest among us who did not have might to make their rights for themselves and had to rely on somebody else to give it to them. And Side Negative was a team that stood up for those people that did not allow these islands to become hells on earth. This team is ridiculous. Let's first ask the question on ideology and on states. And secondly, we'll ask the question of how horrible life is for people on this island. Lastly, I'll ask the question of global security, of the risk these islands pose to global security. Let's firstly talk on ideology and states. The first observation I'd make here is that, regrettably for the second negative, and this is going to sound really silly, but bear with me, it's anarchist islands, not anarchist islands. And that distinction is actually very important, because while these islands are, I guess, nominally called anarchist islands in the topic, they're actually characterized by the following bit of the topic, which is their utter lack of law and law enforcement, not based on a already hotly contested and hotly debated political distinction. That's to say, they cannot get away with saying that the people who go to these islands are anarchists and therefore are good, bog us down in a whole bunch of moral grandstanding about how we're so status quo biased and don't understand a very nuanced political ideology that's really important to people. No, these are people who go to islands that don't have law or law enforcement on them and are not subject to those systems of regulation. Second thing I'd say here is, to the extent that this team talks about status quo bias and talks about morality, and again, morally grandstands that we do not have a direct line to God and we cannot possibly understand what is moral or immoral, we, one, have actually a fairly low bar in terms of what we have to prove is inherently immoral. It is wrong to rape children. It is wrong to manufacture biological weaponry that will tear people apart on a molecular level. It is wrong to harbour terrorists. It is wrong to harbour pirates. Those are the types of things that are pretty morally fucking unambiguous in this debate at this point. The second thing that I'd say here, though, is that to every instance of harm that this team points to that is conducted by a state, in addition to the observation I have already made, that is not and has never been in a debate a reason to make things worse for people. If you buy a single one of our harms, you buy these places are in fact worse than the worst states that exist on Earth right now. You cannot believe that claim. Let's secondly talk about why exactly it's horrible for the people that are on this island. Why should you care about what happens to the people on this island? One, many of the harms that we describe that are regulated by law, not because Big Daddy Law wants to fuck people, but because they are inalienable human rights we all protect and care about, and that every human being has a vested interest in. But secondly, to the extent that this requires the consent of the rest of the global order, everyone is complicit in what goes on these islands. Just because they exist without law doesn't mean they exist without consent. The tacit consent of the rest of the world that stands by and does nothing as the worst atrocities happen on these islands. The islands that the countries that previously just kind of directly owned these islands and now see them up as part of this anarchist island project. What flimsy claims do they bring us here? They say, one, you are free to move. Why? There is no system of law or laws or reasonable power to enforce people's ability to leave. This is not how fiat works in debates. The reason that teams have fiat is because there are systems of power that exist in empirical reality that are capable of manifesting the wills of teams in the way that they set up debates. We say that there is will to manifest in terms of getting people to the island, but once they are there is no system of law or government or power that you can predict because they are all free by the actual model of this debate to act however they wish. Secondly, though, states are very likely to resent systems that threaten their monopoly on global order and will probably respond by doing things like revoking people's citizenship. I point you to the very hilariously titled colony of independent state of Sealand that is off the coast of the United Kingdom, where those people who are there are actually stateless. They do not belong to any state. And so we probably will just refuse to repatriate people, one, out of principle, or two, out of fear for jeopardizing the safety of the people who live on Evil Island and the actual citizens that they have to protect as well. The second reason they give us to why these islands would be the worst places on Earth is people want to live in peaceful communities. I think one, the set of material will give you to believe that there's a selection effect as to the kinds of people that go to this island probably undermines this. But secondly, we explain that many otherwise good people, or many people who otherwise were not corrupted, do get corrupted by things like toxic norms on these places, like the men on Pitcairn Island, who probably never dreamed that they would abuse a child and ended up in decades of a culture of pedophilia, or people who were otherwise well-meaning but were corrupted by the intense pressure of resource restriction there. What kinds of things happen on these islands to the people who live there? We just tell you that the worst forms of violence occur. These guys say you can have mob justice. Cool. More violence that spins out of control, more lynch mobs that address any time somebody commits an offense. Who determines what that offense is? Again, a very easily flippable mechanism here. But secondly, any number of forms of exploitation that looks like sexual exploitation. People can be trafficked to these islands and be fucking unrecoverable for the rest of their life because there is no jurisdiction that is there to protect them. It is insane. And because this happens because you have incentives and the worst-based impulses of some people who live there, and also incentives to do things like turn in income so you can get resources from the rest of the world by doing things like exploiting people. You want weigh these things very highly because they are horrible to the people that they happen to, and they are fairly likely to happen, and even if they don't, even if they happen in a single instance, there is never a mechanism to respond to evil on their side. Because honestly, militaries are the highest form of law enforcement. You cannot go in and principally justify the intervention into any of these places. Let's lastly talk about global security, and the reason that you should care about this is relatively intuitive. You live in the world. I live in the world. I quite like living here and not being the victim of a biological weapon. And there are a series of behaviours that have intense negative externalities to the rest of the world. I'll start with a kind of silly sounding one. Maybe environmental harms that can occur when you just let people have free-for-alls in these places. Like, they can breach a whole bunch of environmental regulations that fuck everyone else up. They can do things like set off explosions on very delicate coral atolls that can make them collapse into the ocean, like happened when we conducted nuclear tests in the Pacific. Just a bunch of harms. No more islands, right? that you cannot safely do under the guise of any state, and obviously sheltering forces that are very, very destructive to states. All these guys have to say is, well, states have negative externalities to each other. Yes, but those states exist in a system of global order where you can do things like impose sanctions, you can do things like impose your will in other ways. This is the worst excesses of anything that humanity is capable of, and there is no way to claw it back. This team are absurd in their principle to understanding what freedom really is. Freedom is being protected in your liberty and in your autonomy and in your will, not whatever these guys support. Never truly proud to propose.
Second negative speech is very interesting, because they tell you that the problem with anarchy islands is that might makes right, and so the strong will prevail. But laws come from the barrel of a gun. It is the government who gets to decide that because it has might, it is okay to kill you, to steal your property, to throw you in jail, to conscript you, and force you to fight against an enemy you believe to be your brother, to enslave you. This happens time and time again, and yet this team has no moral outrage about any of those things. It's only bad when instead of the state doing it, it's someone else doing it. Because states only come up with just laws, but in the absence of states, all rules and norms would surely be unjust. This contradiction undoes this team's case and explains why already side affirmative gets up in the debate. 3 questions. Firstly, on flourishing, secondly, on liberty, and finally, on the tyranny of states. Let's start with the question of flourishing, because this explains to you why it is that these islands would just be good, and if they were good, then we should win the debate, regardless of how any of the other issues fall. We give you a series of intuitive reasons as to why it makes sense that the variety of islands, we tell you could be hundreds if needed be, would just be successful. And obviously, since we get to designate which ones they are, we've just not designate currently inhabited islands, avoiding that harm. 3 seconds. Okay, we can say firstly, the people who go to these islands, think about who the initial people likely to leave are the people who have the greatest incentive to see them be successful. For example, it's the communists who want to see a commune succeed, who want to be able to exist outside of laws, and they obviously would form a group and have incentives to ensure that that project is successful. It's perhaps libertarians who form the Free State Project, where 5,000 of them moved to New Hampshire in an attempt to change the laws of that state and find a place where they could live comfortably, who now would have the option of moving to an island and using their collective power to set up a functioning state in that particular instance. And these people want this community to function. They want it to be good. They want it to be safe. They want it to flourish, which explains why they would do all the things necessary to ensure it did, which explains why they would cooperate with each other, which explains why it would not devolve into the kinds of harms that this team suggests. Secondly, we just point out that there's self-interest involved. You're on the island, you don't want to die. Other people who are on the island don't want to die, so you wouldn't go around killing each other. Thirdly, we just point out that there's information. So if there were a murder island, you just wouldn't go to that island. They don't explain why in a modern digital age with satellite imagery, with access to instantaneous communication, with things like satellite phones, anyone is accidentally tripping into Genocide Island and just be like, whoa, that sucks. Finally, we explain to you that good uses displace bad uses over time. So even if you believe this team, that there is set up some sort of terrorist island, or there is set up a bad island, they don't explain why those people are able to lay claim over that territory into the long run. We explain that uses that are better, that are more productive, that generate more returns, that encourage more people to join, will obviously be better able to take hold of territory, will obviously be better able to have the resources necessary to push out bandits, to push out terrorists, to push out people who refuse to respect the rules of that particular community. No explanation as to why people are antisocial and struggle to form cohesive societies and communities win out over people who cooperate with each other, who have a shared ideology, and who are able to assist each other, who are able to guard their villages, who are able to, protect each other over time, would not win out, which explains why this claim does not make sense. Let's deal with the worst examples they give. Connor spends a long time explaining to you the example of Pitcairn Island. The question I have is, why is this unique in the debate? Why could they have not, instead of going to an uninhabited island, just gone to a desert, or gone to a place where not many people live, and done the exact same thing? Why could they have not just done it in the forests, in the Amazon? These things happen all the time. It's unfortunate that these things happen, but there's no explanation as to why anarchy is a unique feature. There are many places in the world where many bad things happen. Which also explains why the argument about terrorists or pedophiles or a variety of different bad people just doesn't make sense in this debate. because pedophiles exist in a variety of countries. Pedophiles, are able to get away with their crimes as exists. Why would they need to go to the island in the first place? Secondly, even if they did, other people are free to go there and prevent them from doing bad things. And we would suggest that many people might have interests in, since there's no laws, just going and killing people who are making bombs or creating chemical weapons or doing anything that is particularly distasteful. But really the killer for this team is just that sometimes the people who are terrorists or make biological weapons or are pedophiles just take over a country like Somalia or Afghanistan, and then they get to grandstand like second negative and tell you that not only are there particular norms, the rule of the land, because might makes right, they're in fact laws that are good and you have to be thankful for them. We would say it's far better they exist in an anarchist situation where you can stop them rather than where they run a country and force other people to unconsentingly be part of that. So, the conclusion of this issue, just weigh the probabilities. Does it make more sense to believe the tale we tell you, where there is competition between islands, where there is information, where good uses win over bad, or to believe a set of entirely ununique and unmutually exclusive harms that could occur anyway and are never explained to be the most likely use of these islands? Obviously, affirmative and negative loses the debate right there. Secondly, we win the debate for a second time when we explain to you a principle. That every law that this team talks about and its benefits is arbitrary. It imposes some restrictions on people, it allows people to do some other things, but there's no explanation as to why the things it allows are more important than the things that it doesn't allow. The best case for this team is to talk about democratic states where there is some input into the construction of laws, but it is imperfect input. It is still a tyranny of the majority. There's no reason to believe that for many people, those laws reflect what they need or what they want. On our side, we give those people far, far more choice, because they get to choose from the hundreds or thousands of anarchist islands that I've just explained would be successful, that just provide different conceptions of the good life, that guarantee these people would be able to live the way that they want to do, because they're not restricted by poverty, they're not restricted by the capacity to leave or enter states, and that benefit is massive in this debate. And it also explains why people would obviously consent, because there'd be information, because there'd be skepticism, because people would think about these things carefully, all of which explains why this would work well. We get two incredibly lazy responses. Firstly, libertarians are deluded, therefore they would just do this stupidly. One, this is just kind of like a slur against a group of people. It's not really an argument in the first place. We would suggest that people of all political persuasions are probably capable of lots of thought or minimal levels of thought, and so there's no explanation as to why this is particularly likely. Secondly, we explain to you why people in general would be skeptical, there's high friction costs, etc., so that seems unlikely. Secondly, they say, what if someone stops you leaving? Yeah, what if someone stops you leaving your state? Literally what happens in the status quo. No comparison there. At least you had the chance to make a choice in the beginning, and we explain with the information available, it would probably be a good choice. Finally, they say it's bad for children. We explain the vast majority of children have no choice as to where they're born. At least their parents have a choice in this world. It probably on net improves things. Which leads us into the third argument of this debate, which explains why even if you don't believe that everyone on our side consents, we explain comparative for them is no consent for anyone, but also that we improve the lives of people who don't consent, because we minimize the tyranny of the state, because we generate a virtuous cycle of competition where states are forced to compete against anarchist islands, and therefore put a flaw on the conduct of states. If your state wants to enslave you, you can leave. If your state says that your sexuality is wrong, you can leave. If your state does not allow you to live the way that you want to, you can now leave, which immediately means that states are forced to compete. The barriers on entry to countries that exist in status quo no longer hold people back. Their response is to counter fiat and just say, well, we'll allow migration. Sophie explains to you in great detail why that is not realistic and why the fiat is totally out of whack in terms of those particular things working. And the impact of this is it explains why, on our side, people truly are able to access the light of liberty. At the end of this debate, I want to talk about a nation called Eritrea, which is often referred to as a gulag state, because the vast majority of the adult population is conscripted into the army, and political opponents are left to die of exposure in the desert. Its leader spends his time destabilizing the region. Do people in that country consent? Do they have access to liberty? We suggest side affirmative must win.
Laws are the codification of social norms. So if this team's response to all our material about why these islands are going to be absolutely terrible places is that there is still some obeyance of social norms, then what catharsis of statelessness do the people that are going to go to these islands actually get? Because if they have to operate in a world where there are coercive social norms that force them to act in certain ways, why would they go there in the first place? The people that go to these islands are absolutely insane. They're likely to do the things that Connor tells you happen on Pitcairn Island: rape children and women, do the most awfully unconscionable things. We ought not allow this because the people who are the victims of those crimes did not consent to that being happen. I'm going to do two things in this speech. I'm firstly going to tell you why we should, I'm going to first ask the question of, should we care about the fact that people did not consent to living in a state? Because that seems to be the crux of this affirmative team case. And then I'm going to talk about whether these islands are bad places. Hint, they actually are. But I'm going to start by asking the question of whether we should care about the fact that people did not consent to living in a state first. And no, I'm not here proving that laws as they exist right now in the status quo are not coercive. Rather, I'm proving that this form of coercion is not an important one in the context of this debate. This is the only winning strategy for side affirmative. So, why is it not important that this state is coercive? For discrete reasons. Firstly, the anarchy on these anarchy islands and living on them is something that is in and of itself coercive as well. You don't get any sort of delta in the amount of coercion that you are faced with by virtue of living on these islands, because we explained to you down the bench that you cannot consent to being there because you're seduced into moving onto these islands, you're seduced into changing your surroundings. You also don't consent to what the impacts of these islands actually are because you've never lived in a society that is like that. You've never lived in a stateless society. You don't know what is going to happen to you, so you can't consent to the impacts of that state. Finally, we tell you that kids that are born on these islands are probably ones that are unable to consent to that in the first place, right? And note that given that it is something that is drastically different to the rest of the children around the world that, do have a state that they live in that they can consent to, that is probably pretty bad. These kids cannot consent to living on Anarchy Island. Children might love living in states with laws. I love living in a state with a law. That was probably something that is relatively important to weigh in this debate. That coercion is something that applies in both sides of the house. Sophie's response is that, well, we actually misunderstand anarchy and it is a legitimate political system. Even if we did misunderstand it, and those people who are moving to these islands understand it perfectly, and you guys understand it perfectly, they did not still consent to the perfect conception of those societies, so it was not something that mattered. That's the first reason why their argument here is unimportant. The second reason as to why you ought not care about their principle of statelessness here is because, and this one is really important, because under the side affirmative conception of these islands, you still have a vast amount of social coercion, because for the reason that I explained in my introduction, you still have social norms that are likely to operate on these islands. These norms dictate how you behave, and maybe you can do things like buck the norms, right? Obviously this has lower consequences than bucking a law because you don't have the law being imposed onto you, but this just goes to show that the amount of coercion that you still have on their side is still one that is very prevalent. If you wanted to have an imperfect amount of social coercion, maybe they should just move into a log cabin in the woods and live their life that way. This is not a justification for making these entire new things in the pursuit of statelessness, right? Entirely nonsensical. The third reason as to why we should not care about the affirmative team principle here is that we should not care about achieving a libertarian utopia if it causes harms to other people. And that's not to say that this causes harms to the people living on the islands. It's to say that the existence of these islands causes harms to people that are living outside of the islands. And the people who are living outside of these islands and never opted into these systems also face a significant amount of harm, as we explained to you down the bench. So you should not abrogate the choice and the ability of those people who don't live on those islands to live their lives as they would like to because a group of crazies wants to make the life bad for everybody else. Why is it that you cause negative externalities that abrogate other people's rights of choice? Because we tell you that when you are going to have a bunch of these people move to, a bunch of these anarchists move to the anarchist islands, this affects these unconsenting third parties in relatively bad ways, because we told you could do things like develop weaponry on these islands because that is something that is now legal. You can do things like develop bioweapons, formulate the worst kinds of drugs that ruin lives and then get exported to all the other citizens of the globe. That was something that meant that every single other person in the world could not consent to the existence of these islands, and you ought not allow that to continue because of the will of some crazy people, right? We should violate people's freedom of choice if it causes harm to other people. That's why we do things like criminalize hate speech, because hate speech is something that causes a huge amount of hatred and offense in the community, even though it abrogates a person's freedom of speech. That was something we thought was sufficiently bad to abrogate another right. right? We should not allow this to happen. The fourth and final reason that you should not allow this island to happen, you should not care about this principle, is because really bad things happen on this island. We've explained this down the bench, and that's what the second question in the speech is going to be. The fourth reason, knowing that you only need to believe one of the four reasons that I give you in this speech in order to give this debate to side negative. So, why are these islands going to be absolutely terrible places? We explained to you that violence is incredibly likely to happen. You're going to have sexual assault, racial hate crimes, pedophilia to the children born there. What are the affirmative team's claims on this idea as to why these islands are actually going to be good places? The first thing that they say is that, well, they're really handy ways for people to escape oppressive regimes. We brought to you a counter model that says to you that you can actually escape this on our side of the house. They're like, oh, you don't have the fear because you have to reform a bunch of immigration systems. You have to reform a bunch of immigration systems too. Like, you have to allow people to become stateless and regain statehood. You have to pay for that transport. That was a huge cost. If we can get the UN to, pass their side of the house, we can also get the UN to pass our side of the house. It's deeply unclear why you can't, escape oppressive regimes on either side of the house. But I would also note that this is obviously a far smaller and less important stakeholder than the ones that we care about, than the ones who did not consent to the victims, to being victims of those crimes. So I don't think this is people escaping oppressive regimes claim for them really stacks up in this debate. The second thing that they tell you is that actually these islands are going to be good places because people going to go to them and obey good norms. They want you to see those communities succeed, so they have incentives to make them good places. A couple of responses here. Firstly, I don't think there is anybody to set up these norms because people who want to go to these islands are individuals that dislike norms, i.e. laws, so they probably don't want to abide by some sort of higher moral code within those societies. Secondly, even if these norms are something that exists within those islands, I would note that makes it an unappealing place for those people to go, given that they don't like being subjected to norms. But thirdly, even if you do have overarching social norms, really terrible things are likely to happen anyway, because people can still buck these trends because there is no deterrent factor of the law stopping you from doing something. Because if you get into a tiff with your neighbor, you can just kill them instead of going to some sort of dispute resolution mechanism. If you see someone you're jealous of an item that they have, you can go steal them and kill them so that no one sees the evidence. Those were the sorts of things that their system encouraged. That was an incredibly terrible thing. Thirdly, though, the people who are likely to go to these islands, as we characterized to you and as they characterized to you, are likely to be people that are particularly unresponsive to social norms. That's to say that they like breaking the law, they like doing things that are particularly heinous. Note why, that's the reason why libertarians support changing the age of consent to fucking 12. That was awful. Udai said that the example of Peckhead Island that we give to you as to why this is likely to happen is one that is not mutually exclusive because that happened in the status quo. This example was simply a way to explain to you why living on that island is an absolutely terrible thing and why it's conducive to really awful behavior. It obviously wasn't an analysis of the status quo. The final thing that they say is that, well, pedophiles can commit crimes in the status quo anyway, so it's unimportant. But obviously you still have in the status quo the veneer of the law that makes these people not willing to commit those crimes in the first place, because under their side we actually flip it and get more of those awful activities like pedophilia, like sexual assault, because they feel like there is nothing restraining those awful kinds of behavior onto them. They feel that they're more compelled to do those things because of the fact that society is allowing them. At the end of this, you ought not by their principle. These islands are awful places. We should not allow it.
Of what happens on these islands, or what is likely to happen, or honestly what even happens in a few instances. And that is important because the harms that we provide are so severe and harm the people who are so vulnerable and cannot consent in any circumstances, that even if they only happen in a few instances, they absolutely outweigh the largely kind of principled benefit that only some people care about on their side of the house. But also, the other reason that this is important is because if a large part of these islands are terrible places to live, are random coral atolls, because that's lots of uninhabited islands in the status quo that are in the middle of an ocean, it totally takes the legs out from under this argument of choice, because the choice between evil island and evil state is hardly a choice at all, and that will, I think, will soundly win us the debate there, because people do not have good choices and meaningful autonomy there. I will ask this question by explaining what the frameworks that each team gives you to explain what will happen on the islands are. You will very clearly see that one is far better proven, but also far more intuitive than the other. Let's firstly start with side affirmative. The affirmative tells us that these islands will be good and that bad things will largely not happen on them or will be meted out for a couple of reasons. The first is that they say, well, the first people to get on the ferry will be good people who have the largest incentive for these islands to succeed, and definitely not Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab who are already looking for a way to escape the state's thumb and have now provided a free ferry ticket to do so and to be totally outside the jurisdiction of any state on Earth and be totally outside the global order. The next claim is that there will be competition between islands and states that will eventually improve both and give people that level of meaningful choice, even though we've established down the bench that there's no way for this team to guarantee people the right to leave either that island to go back to a state or, in fact, that island to go to another island. So, what is the framework of understanding that side negative gives you? We first tell you that there are already people under the status quo who are actively trying to escape the purview of states, who in many instances already operate outside of them, and that those people have the least to lose by leaving the community of states and the moral community that the rest of the world exists in. They have the fewest ties to community, they have besides themselves and their own organization, and they have the most to gain from going to these islands because it means that they can continue to profiteer, to traffic, to manufacture weapons, to manufacture drugs, to cause chaos for the rest of the world, and as that is their ideological mandate, and that those people, in fact, will be the first people on the ferries because they have the largest incentive to do so. We secondly explain that even if it is not those groups of people in all instances, we explain that many ordinary people do have their bad behavior meaningfully constrained by the laws of the state in which they live, which means that they would, in the absence of those laws, engage in particularly immoral behavior, engage in constructing norms of, for instance, things like pedophilia, things that happen in Pitcairn Island, which is of course just one example that was a particularly unlikely scenario that happened under the status quo, one we ought not see repeated. A second question I'll ask in this reply is whether these islands are unique in the harm that they bring to the world. Because this team is incredibly frustrating and morally bankrupt and lazy when they try to rebuff this by giving us a series of whataboutisms. What about states that do bad things, they say? Okay, and you remove many of those bad things and remove it entirely from the system of global development and global norms that was at least able to crack down on some of the worst instances of state behavior, make it so much easier for them to do so. Impacts are, in fact, allowed to operate on a sliding scale, and we are in fact allowed to say that two wrongs do not make a right, and that two instances of human trafficking do not cancel each other out because one is conducted under the guise of a state, one is conducted on an island. Their next whataboutism is to say, what about when people do this, when weirdos go off into log cabins or go off into the desert and abuse people? This team uses a considerable amount of fiat to instantaneously and at their request drop them off on an island where it is so much easier to do that, where it is so much harder for any state to crack down upon them, and in fact where any state on earth, any government, any force for good is completely unable to reach that group of people. Again, sliding scale, more bad things does not a victory for this team make. Our arguments are incredibly easy to understand, they're incredibly practically focused, they do win this debate.